Namaskar viewers, hello and welcome to Sansad TV. I'm Tina Jha, you're watching Perspective. It's been a historic day for India and the European Union, the world's second largest and fourth largest economies, together accounting for nearly 25% of global GDP and about one-third of global trade, have announced the conclusion of the long-awaited India-European Union Free Trade Agreement. The landmark breakthrough was announced at the 16th India-EU Summit by Prime Minister Narendra Modi and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, marking a new chapter in one of the world's most significant economic partnerships. The conclusion of the FTA positions India and the European Union as trusted partners committed to open markets, greater predictability and inclusive sustainable growth.
यूरोपियन यूनियन के लीडर्स भारत के गणतंत्र दिवस समारोह में मुख्य अतिथि के रूप में शामिल हुए। आज एक और ऐतिहासिक अवसर है जब विश्व की दो सबसे बड़ी लोकतांत्रिक शक्तियां अपने संबंधों में एक निर्णायक अध्याय जोड़ रही है। फ्रेंड्स, पिछले कुछ वर्षों में भारत और यूरोपियन यूनियन के संबंधों में उल्लेखनीय प्रगति हुई है। साझा लोकतांत्रिक मूल्यों, आर्थिक सिनर्जी और मजबूत पीपल टू पीपल टाइज के आधार पर हमारी साझेदारी नई ऊंचाइयों तक पहुंच रही है।
The European Union is among India's largest trading partners, with bilateral trade in both goods and services witnessing steady growth in recent years. In 2024-25, India-EU trade in goods stood at 11.5 lakh crore rupees, with exports at 6.4 lakh crore rupees and imports at 5.1 lakh crore rupees. Trade in services between the two sides reached 7.2 lakh crore rupees, underscoring the depth and diversity of this relationship. Now, this free trade agreement is expected to significantly boost trade and investment flows, expand market access to Indian goods and services, strengthen resilient and diversified supply chains, and promote innovation, technology transfer, and regulatory cooperation. Importantly, it also holds the promise of generating new employment opportunities, which is very important for India's youth. To understand in greater detail what this integration between two large, diverse and open market economies means for businesses, for workers, also for the global economic order, we are joined by a diverse panel. I'm delighted to welcome Ambassador Prabhu Dayal, former diplomat, Dr. Sheetal Sharma, Associate Professor, Center for European Studies, JNU, and Mr. Dilip Chenoy, former Secretary General, FICCI. Thank you all for taking out time today for this very important conversation. Ambassador, to you first. At a time when we are seeing that the global trading system is under visible stress because of multiple factors, there are the developed powers which are turning inward. How do you read the timing of the India-EU FTA? And from a diplomatic lens, do you see this more as a geopolitical signal rather than an economic agreement between two large democracies?
Well, Tina, first of all, thanks for having me on your show. You have rightly referred to the global challenges, and you have raised a very important question, whether it's just a signal or whether it means something more in terms of real trade. Now, the India-EU trade deal has been referred to as the mother of all deals. But I think it's a game changer. And I say so because it is not a mere signal. It goes much beyond that. And the scale of its impact could be significant in the years to come. Firstly, it will connect a market of about 2 billion people and would cover roughly 25% of the global GDP. Then, in all likelihood, India's exports to Europe, which are around $130 billion, could go up within the next 5-6 years to $250 billion or even $270 billion. So it will be not mere signaling, it will be concrete achievement. Then, of course, there is this aspect of job creation. The agreement is expected to lead to millions of new jobs, particularly in labor-intensive sectors like textiles, apparel, and footwear. So this is going to be a very, very concrete achievement. Then, of course, in terms of signaling and in terms of global politics, this trade deal could be a geopolitical pivot. Because, as we all know, it takes place amid rising global tariffs from the US, not just against India, but against European countries too.
That's right.
So it will ease the pressure on both sides. And of course, it will also reduce dependence on China, both for India and for the European Union. So in that sense, it will have an impact on supply chains. But then, let me mention that it goes beyond trade, because this pact is not just about goods. It includes agreements on defense and security, on data sharing, and on the mobility for students and professionals. This is a very important aspect because, after the H-1B visa curbs, which have been placed by the United States, and the huge costs in obtaining H-1B visas, this agreement on the mobility of students and professionals with the European Union would be very, very important. So let me just sum up a few things. There are very important sectors which can be called the key winning sectors. Textiles and apparel is one, because the removal of 10 to 12% duties will make Indian garments highly competitive against rivals like Vietnam and Bangladesh. Then, of course, there is the pharma and chemical sector, because there are faster regulatory approvals and lower barriers which are expected, and these will boost India's role as a pharmacy for Europe.
That's
then,
right.
Of course, the IT and services sector, because new mobility norms will facilitate easier movement for Indian tech professionals and researchers. Of course, there are huge gains for Europe too, because Europe will get easier access to India's massive market for automobiles, machinery, and luxury goods, like, of course, wines and spirits.
That's true. So we'll talk about these incremental gains, get an industry perspective from Mr. Chenoy. But before that, the geopolitical aspect that I raised earlier on, a related question to Professor Sharma as well. Professor, your thoughts on the timing and the significance of this deal, because at a time when we are seeing protectionist rhetoric growing louder in parts of the world, how do you understand the EU moving in the opposite direction? We've seen that happening, especially post-COVID and the supply chain shocks that the continent has witnessed. But this, in case, means deeper integration with India.
Yes, of course, Tina, there are certain factors which has led to the culmination of the deal today. Now, let me unpack them one by one, and particularly the conditions in which European Union is acting right now. The deal was about to, it was being negotiated for a long period of time, but why now? And what are those triggers, which are the geopolitical factors that we talk about? I see 50% economic aspect or dimension of the deal and 50% also the geopolitical factors. And why I say so? Because if you look at the conditions of the European Union currently, right now, if you understand that, the war has been happening on the Eastern Front for last 4 years almost now. Point number two, Trump 2.0 has given enough shocks to European Union in terms of marginalizing NATO and also imploding NATO from inside. The reason being that now, if in case Greenland is not handed over to America, then there would be severe consequences. Third is the China, where it always, is kind of a hegemon in terms of economic might and also flexing its military muscle in the South China Sea, Indo-Pacific region. So China also becomes an irritant. And at the same time, the domestic constituencies, the shock after Brexit or the internal economic issues and all these things. In totality, the sum total, the culmination of all these international, external, and internal factors have led to a situation where the European Union is looking for trusted and like-minded partners. And why India fits the bill is that because India once again has been facing some of the brunt of the Europe for the Trump's uncertain imposition of tariffs and the kind of decisions that he has taken in the last 4-5 months. Yeah. So in order to offset that, I think it is ripe time. I wouldn't say it's ripe in the sense that we took a long period of time, but ripe in the condition, the geopolitical conditions where the like-minded powers have to come together in order to offset the shocks which have been given by the big powers on both the sides. So that is why geopolitically it carries a lot of weight, it carries a lot of message that two entities as big as almost 25% of GDP and world population, they come together and make business easy for each other. So it holds a lot of meaning for the domestic politics, domestic economies, and also the international messages that these FTAs are going to send across to the world.
In terms of FTAs, it's been a good year, Mr. Chinoy, but tell us about this. It's the mother of all deals. From an industry perspective, it's being hailed as game-changing. What are some of the incremental gains? In fact, if you could explain to us and our viewers some of the most immediate advantages that our businesses are going to have once this FTA comes into effect.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you for having me on the show. And let me actually drill it down a bit more. So if you first starting at the macro, so, in this goods sector, we are going to get access to majority of the EU tariff lines, which is about 96.8% of the EU tariff lines. Indian exporters are going to get access to at zero duty. We're also offering 93.2 tariff lines to the EU. There are certain sectors which are sensitive, which have been kept out of the purview or have special dispensation. There are certain agricultural sectors like dairy, soya meal, poultry, etc., which have been kept out of this deal, certain fruits and vegetables. Second, in the auto sector, it's a tariff quota rate mechanism which is coming in. It's applicable to only vehicles above 15,000 euro. And there's a 250,000 vehicle cap every year. And each of the duties are, the whole sectors are divided into 3 segments. And there's going to be a duty reduction, from 110 to 70 and, and gradually to 10%. So that's going to happen there. In steel also, there's a specific kind of a roadmap. What is very interesting, and as Ambassador Dayal mentioned, there are certain sectors which are going to benefit immensely from this. He, of course, mentioned the apparels and textiles, where the apparels and textile sector was the first sector when the discussions actually started. The initial discussions started in 2001, 2002. Then they broke off, and then they restarted, and they broke off, and they restarted, right? And it is very interesting that we can look at huge agricultural exports, because EU exports about $125 billion worth of textiles every year. India only had a 5 to 6% share. China had 30. And, as Ambassador Dayal mentioned, we have competitors with Vietnam, Bangladesh, and if I mention Pakistan also, we gain a significant advantage against those there. The second sector is actually gems and jewelry, right? The industry association there has predicted that we could double our exports to about 91,000 crores in the next 3 years. The leather and leather sector is even more ambitious. They say that, the exports to the EU could reach 6 billion by 2030. Now, these 3 sectors are hugely labor intensive. And like as Ambassador Dayal mentioned, they would create jobs in India going in here. The chemical sector, for example, is we're going to get zero duty on 97% of India's export basket. It's giving us an access to about a $500 billion EU chemical market. Marine products, again, import, improved aspects. So if you look at the traditional Indian exports, spices, tea, and processed foods, this is going to open up a huge area. Politically, it's a very interesting FTA because if you take either the goods, bilateral goods, or bilateral services, right? We always had a trade surplus with the EU. This is one of the few countries where we are doing an FTA, where we had trade surpluses and trying to actually build on it.
In fact, I was about to ask you that one of the unique aspects when you look at the outcomes is that it goes much more beyond just the tariff cuts. It includes regulatory cooperation points. It talks about digital trade, the carbon rules, mobility, in fact, even AI and semiconductors. Is it safe to say it's an indication of sorts that FTAs are now being, more about shaping rules and standards than just about boosting trade volumes? Because that is where we've already seen significant and steady growth. But it's now more about shaping the rules and standards as per the evolving geopolitics and the geoeconomic scenario.
Absolutely, Tina. And, unfortunately, for the Indian aspects, and it's very important to tie it into the Prime Minister's Man Ki Baat address earlier, he talked about improving quality. And, Indian industry has to really improve quality and maybe meet EU standards, etc. But there's a facilitation mechanism like Ambassador Dayal mentioned. There's a huge $500 million kind of a thing for green energy. But very interestingly, perhaps this is the first FTA which has a specific chapter on MSMEs. And in addition to that, it is going to put designated people on both sides who are going to help MSMEs on either side, and that, and this is a huge integration into supply chains. And this is possibly, a template, like you mentioned, going beyond traditional just tariff reductions or, even service line reductions. The totalization agreement, which you are asking for a long time, is actually included here as a social security arrangement. But this is, like everyone is saying, a game changer, historic, and maybe a trendsetter going forward. And as Professor Sharma mentioned, in the current geopolitical scenario, it is a very positive development, which is looking at integration rather than disruption and tariffs and all of that. So it's a very interesting positioning that India and EU have been able to achieve.
That's right. Ambassador, based on what Professor Sharma and Mr. Chinoy have said, the significant thrust that we've seen in the manner in which the negotiations took place in recent months, especially last year when we had a College of EU Commissioners visit. And I think that's from where the momentum began towards conclusion of negotiations. We heard the Prime Minister talk about how it's important in terms of integrating India more deeply now into the value chains. Help us understand what practical changes will that bring about. Also, does this kind of thrust move India from being a low-cost production base to now becoming a more say, rule-based, standards-compliant, innovation-linked economy?
Well, India will continue to be a low-cost manufacturer because of the fact that wages in India are much lower than those in many other countries. But, the change of the manufacturing scenario is very evident if we look at the Indian industry, because from being a manufacturer of very simple items, now we can compete with the very best in terms of the quality and the type of products that our industry manufactures. But as Mr. Chinoy was pointing out, there is something more to this agreement than just trade and economics, because as he said, the context in which it is taking place is very significant. And that context is now the closer strategic relationship which is emerging between India and the European Union. So beyond trade, the pact serves as a major geopolitical stabilizer amid global uncertainty. And that uncertainty, to a very great extent, has been created by the Trump administration. So this agreement between India and the EU becomes a hedge against global turmoil. And the deal could act as an insurance against trade disruptions caused by high US tariffs. Of course, it's also a hedge against increasing dependence of most countries on the Chinese manufacturing process. So it is something that works against the pressures both from the United States and the pressures on account of dependence on China. But more than that, there is also a security and defense partnership which comes alongside this agreement. And you were right, Tina, in pointing out that trade agreements go much, much beyond trade itself. They are, in fact, point us to a wider partnership. And parallel to the free trade agreement, both sides are finalizing a broader security and defense partnership. And this could include cooperation on maritime security, for example, in the Indo-Pacific, counter-terrorism, and cyber defense. So this agreement positions, or rather signals, a shift in, along with global positioning in India's trade posture towards a deeper integration with Western democracies and rules-based global orders.
That's right. Strategic and defense partnership is something that we have with individual countries in the EU, but with the larger bloc, it's the first of its kind, and that's why it's extremely significant. We will perhaps find time to discuss more on the dimensions of this kind of partnership. But coming back to the FTA, and as was mentioned, especially with regard to services, the skilled mobility, which clearly, Professor Sharma, seemed to be a major win that we see in this agreement. In fact, as Mr. Chinoy said, this is one of the dividend is something that we've been speaking about for a long time, but through FTAs like this, we are providing a pathway for long-term integration of India's skill into some of these high-skill sectors abroad, and especially in context of the European countries.
Tina, Indian talent is much sought after all across the world. And there are a couple of reasons for it, and also the context in which we talk about migration and mobility agreements we have with major countries in the European Union as well. Now, one thing is very important, that what sort of skill we are looking forward, in order to send across to European Union. We have a demand from very high-skilled professional IT sector, artificial intelligence, and also in the field of business, engineering, medical professionals. But at the same time, the mid-skill segment is also much sought after in terms of nurses, with cultural diplomacy, also yoga teachers, and a whole lot of range of the people, those who can be absorbed there. Also, along with that is the mobility of students and researchers. What is very important is to have a conducive ecosystem for these people to travel and to be taken care of. Say, for example, ease of doing work visas, student visas, working after completion of your degrees or diplomas. So these conditions are in the part of Mode 1, Mode 3, Mode 4 mobility agreements, which are in there. And what is very important to note is that over a period of time, Trump being restrictive in terms of attracting talent from India, EU happens to be a better choice as compared to US now for a while, until unless the things ease out with the United States of America. And one thing to note, that we have almost equal number of diaspora spread across the countries of the European Union. So this also leads to a kind of giving a societal foundation to the economic relationship that we are fostering or forging on the basis of the free trade agreement. And societal bonds, I would say, last longer than the economic transactions, and which is very important. Down the line, 10 years from now, if large number of people are there, they attract skill, they retain that skill, the skill contributes to the economy, I think it's going to change the kind of dimensions that are there of India-EU relationship. It would be much more people-to-people connect, cultural contacts, and there will be a perceptible change in the perceptions about the EU, because your presence as a society, as a cultural block there, changes the way you look at the entity. So in sum total, the migration and mobility agreements are going to give a more humane touch, a more diasporic touch to the entire deal. And this is what I look forward to, because for the last many years, if you look at India-EU relationship, it has been there. It reminds me of a statement made by former Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee that there is a lot of symmetry between the two entities, India and the EU. There is a lot of convergence over values, but somewhere the close intensification of the relationship has eluded both of us. 20 years down the line, now the time has come for both of us to realize that underutilized potential. And migration and mobility, movement of professional, also happens to be one of the very important chapter into it. And this will certainly have the positive consequences for future.
Since you spoke about positive consequences, let me ask a domestic industry-related question to Dr. Chinoy now. We know the EU, it's a global leader in climate-linked trade measures, including its carbon border adjustment mechanism. In fact, for quite a long time, this mechanism held our negotiations on the India-EU FTA. We've managed to secure some flexibilities and cooperation clauses on the FTA. But in the long run, how do you think this will push the Indian industry to sort of speed up, accelerate its green transition? And then how do you look at the sustainability-linked trade adding as a competitive advantage for our industry?
So this is a very specific question on CABAM and specific industries. So, when I started off, I mentioned that there is a carve-out for steel because of the energy-intensive nature of steel. Now, there are two other things that are playing out here in the background, which possibly the viewers here would not understand, but it's very important for them to communicate so that they understand. While India has a net zero target of 2070, which the Prime Minister announced there, many individual companies are looking at net zero targets of 2035, and some are have an internal target of really earlier than that. And many of them include steel producing and other other carbon intensive producing sectors. Now, for them, this is really an opportunity to accelerate and then go forward. Now, one of the major challenges, actually two challenges that industry has been talking about, since this deal has been announced. One is the adherence to the CABAM and need for clarity and fair in this going forward. And, how do we inbuild the flexibilities that have been given in the FTA for the CABAM mechanism, the carbon border tax mechanism. And the other one is on the standards. Just to give you an example, let's say, in bottled water, right? The EU standard is built around what can be measured. In India, we have a certain number, right? Which is maybe higher than the EU. So Indian industry would have to adopt itself to meet stricter EU standards. And that's good in the long term because then more markets open up. The same products can be then exported to other markets. And given the fact that it's going to add to collaboration and you're going to have a lot of joint ventures and integration in the supply chain coming up, it's a positive for industry. Yes, immediate challenges both in terms of the carbon border tax and the standards is a very interesting aspect. I just want to spend about a few seconds on what Professor Sharma and you talked about mobility. One of the big differences between the US and EU is that a lot of English-speaking people can very confidently go out into the US. Whereas in Europe, we need to, have German or Italian speaking here. And, that opens up opportunities for, let's say, the languages school in JNU, from where you come from, Professor Sharma, or others. And a lot of opportunities to do languages for the young people here. I've been advising companies who are training young people who are air conditioning mechanics, who work in the meat processing industry, who work in the construction industry for Germany. And they are very excited about this because they say now it's going to open up the whole of Europe.
That's right.
Because it's a very interesting thing. But again, standards, languages, and carbon tax are things that I think are challenges and Indian industry needs to work to address them, and we need clarity and fairness, which has been built into the agreement so far from the EU side.
Absolutely. So as the agreement unfolds, we will talk about the specifics and look at how they're playing out and impacting different sectors. But what's the major takeaway today is that it's a historic agreement which opens up huge opportunities for two large democracies but open economies, which in this shifting global order have decided to come together and work for the benefit of their peoples, their businesses. With that, we'll have to wrap up the conversation. Time allows us to take up only that much on this edition of Perspective. Thank you once again, Ambassador, Professor Sharma and Mr. Chinoy, for joining us for this very engaging conversation. To you viewers, thank you very much for your time as well.